I used to believe the scariest part of living in isolation was the loneliness or the absolute silence. I was completely wrong. The real terror is when the silence is broken by something your mind simply can't process. I was in my room on the ground floor of my house, which is about 15 miles from downtown Seattle, surrounded by a dense, unforgiving forest. The temperature outside had plummeted to around 30 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of bone-chilling cold that creates a thick fog clinging to the ground. I was reading a book, trying to ignore the oppressive darkness pressing against my window pane, when a primal instinct made me look up. The feeling of being watched was as physical as a touch. When my eyes focused through the fogged glass, my heart stopped. There, a few feet from my window, was a creature that defied all logic and biology. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a giant wolf, it was something straight out of hell. He stood on two legs, staring at me with a wicked, predatory intelligence that paralyzed me. The fear was so absolute that my lungs forgot how to function. The only thing separating me from that abomination was a thin layer of glass and my 3 cane corso dogs. Brutus, Titan, and Nero sensed his presence long before I did. They didn't retreat, but formed a protective barrier between the window and the spot where I stood, frozen in terror. To understand the gravity of that night, you need to picture where I live. My property is about 10 acres of heavily wooded land. The dirt road leading to the main highway is nearly 3 miles long, winding through hills and trees that block any sign of civilization. When it gets dark here, the darkness is absolute, heavy, almost suffocating. I moved here seeking peace, wanting to escape the chaos of the city, and I trusted in the protection my dogs gave me. Cane corsos are formidable animals, weighing over 120 pounds each, historically bred for war and big game hunting. On that particular night, their behavior changed drastically, hours before the nightmare began. Usually, they are relaxed around the house, but from late afternoon, when the temperature began to drop into the 40s Fahrenheit, they were tense. They patrolled the doors, sniffed the cracks in the windows, and kept their ears perked up, picking up something in the woods that I couldn't hear or see. I deduced it was a lone deer or perhaps a coyote prowling the edge of the yard a few dozen yards away. I could never have imagined that we were being hunted by an alpha predator far superior to any known animal. The air inside the house seemed to have changed, becoming thick and charged with a strange electricity, as if the environment itself knew of the atrocity approaching from the shadows of the ancient trees. The tension inside the house increased when the normal sounds of the forest disappeared. There was no rustling of leaves, no nighttime birdsong, or the rustling of small animals. It was a vacuum of sound, which in nature means only one thing: the presence of a top predator. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water and noticed that the 3 dogs were positioned in a semicircle in front of the back glass door, which leads to the wooden deck. They weren't making any sound, which was unusual. Their posture was rigid. The muscles beneath their dark fur were fully contracted, prepared for a lethal attack. I slowly approached the door, straining my eyes to try to see beyond the dim light from the deck post, which illuminated only a radius of about 15 feet. Beyond that light, the forest was an abyss of darkness. It was then that I noticed a dark mass detaching itself from the shadows of the trees about 50 yards away. At first, my mind tried to rationalize, thinking it was the shadow of a tree swaying in the icy wind, but there was no wind. The mass began to move with a disturbing purpose, not on all fours like a common animal, but walking upright, its shoulders swaying in a humanoid yet colossal and grotesque way. As the creature drew closer, closing the 50-yard gap to 30 yards, the details of its form began to become vividly clear and terrifying under the dim moonlight. It must have easily been over 8 feet tall. Its legs were bent backward like those of a canid, the so-called hox, but supported an incredibly broad and muscular torso that resembled that of a human bodybuilder. Its arms were disproportionately long, ending in what appeared to be hands with sharp claws that hung down to its knees. Its head was that of a huge wolf, with pointed ears that touched the top, but its snout was slightly flatter, and its features possessed an expression of pure evil. Worst of all were its eyes. They reflected a terrifying amber light, gleaming with a malevolent and conscious intensity. It wasn't just wandering around, it was surveying the house, examining its vulnerabilities. I stood paralyzed in the kitchen, the glass slipping from my sweaty hands and falling to the floor, shattering into dozens of pieces. The loud noise instantly caught his attention. The creature's head turned toward me with a swift, unnatural movement. Our eyes met across the yard, and I felt my soul being pulled into a pit of utter despair. He knew I was there, and worse, seemed to revel in my evident panic. It was at that precise moment of eye contact that the creature took the most terrifying step toward my house. It covered the remaining distance with a silent and frightening agility for something of its size, getting to within just 10 feet of my glass door. My 3 cane corsos immediately lunged at the glass from the inside, pounding their paws and bodies with impressive protective fury, baring all their teeth in a display of deadly aggression. Despite all the strength and brutality of my dogs, the dogman was not intimidated. He stopped, rising even higher, the muscles of his chest expanding as he looked down, observing the dogs through the door with arrogant disdain. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying the tactical situation, assessing whether the effort of breaking the glass and confronting 3 massive dogs was worth it to reach me. The smell that began to seep through the cracks in the window was indescribable, a putrid mixture of decaying flesh, wet earth, and rusty metal. I began to slowly back away toward the hallway, sensing that the glass wouldn't last a second if he decided to force his way in. He raised one of his enormous claws and slowly scratched the wooden frame outside, marking his territory, while keeping his eyes fixed on me, assuring me that the night was only beginning, and that the real nightmare was yet to come. I recoiled from the kitchen, my knees trembling so much I could barely stand. The creature, realizing the dogs wouldn't yield an inch of their territory, took a step back and disappeared into the darkness of the tree line, but I knew it hadn't gone away. The heavy atmosphere lingered. To give you an idea of my situation, my house is a rustic wooden structure with large windows designed to let in natural light during the cloudy Washington days. Those same windows, which I'd always found beautiful, now seemed like absurdly fragile frames. If it wanted to, that monster could shatter any of them with a single frontal blow. The house is about 2,000 square feet, divided into an open floor with the bedroom at the end of a long hallway. I crawled along the floor, keeping my body below window level, while the air seemed to grow thinner and thinner. My 3 cane corsos didn't relax for a single second. They began to move in a group, going from the back door to the living room window, following something outside that I couldn't see, but which they tracked perfectly by smell and muffled footsteps. The weight of knowing that a monstrous predator nearly 9 feet tall was circling my home was enough to destroy anyone's sanity. The darkness outside the house seemed to have a life of its own, swallowing any vestige of hope or safety. I crawled into the central room, feeling the icy wooden floor through my clothes. The smell of decay emanating from the creature hadn't disappeared. On the contrary, it began to seep through the ventilation cracks, polluting the air with an odor of death so intense it made my stomach churn. I tried to block the panic by rationalizing the situation, repeating to myself that predators in nature avoid human structures and that it would soon lose interest and return to the mountains. But the urban legends I had always ignored now hammered in my head in a punishing way. It wasn't an ordinary wild animal. There was malice in the way it had looked at me earlier, a cruel and calculating intellect that found extreme pleasure in my evident despair. The dogs continued their absolutely silent patrol, their muscles tense, focused on the side wall of the house, indicating that the anomaly was moving toward the outside area where the main power panel and fuel generator were located. It was at that exact moment that the true psychological horror set in, foreshadowing that his intentions went far beyond a simple hunt. With my heart pounding violently against my ribs, I realized I needed immediate help and some lethal means of defense in case he decided the windows were no longer an obstacle. Keeping my posture crouched so as not to expose my silhouette, I reached for the coffee table and grabbed my cell phone. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I tried to turn on the screen, only to be confronted with the most terrifying and desperate reality of the night: the indication that there was no network service available. I live about 15 miles from the shopping center, and the signal has always been slightly unreliable due to the mountains, but being completely isolated from communication at that moment was a terrible sentence of vulnerability. I stared at the illuminated screen with pure despair, feeling hot tears of panic welling up in my tired eyes. Without a phone, I was completely on my own against an abomination of nature. That's when a thought focused on survival cut through my panic, and I remembered the 12-gauge shotgun I kept stored in the safe in my room. My father had strongly insisted that I take defensive shooting training and keep a long gun at home for basic security, since the property is largely isolated. I slowly rose from the living room floor, beckoning the dogs with a small hand gesture. Brutus and Nero immediately came to me, while Titan remained as a sentinel in the room, watching the exact wall where the putrid smell was overwhelming. The path to the bedroom seemed to have multiplied in physical distance. The hallway was shrouded in nocturnal shadows, and each step on the rustic oak floor caused me to break out in a cold sweat, with the irrational terror that any tiny vibration would reveal my position to the being lurking nearby. As I moved slowly, I could hear incredibly heavy footsteps crunching the gravel of the yard, just a few feet from the outside wall of the hallway. The creature was following me parallel to the outside of the house. The weight of each step it took made the ground beneath my feet tremble subtly. With each movement, I mentally calculated that it must easily weigh over 400 pounds, a colossal mass of dark muscle and primal fury that had no intention of abandoning the hunt. I finally reached the master bedroom and took the heavy weapon out of its case, feeding the tube with cartridges using sweaty hands, mentally praying that I would never have to find out if regular lead ammunition would have any stopping power against that walking nightmare. The cold metal of the weapon in my trembling hands gave me a momentary false sense of security. I checked the safety and crouched in the darkest, most protected corner of the room, where I had a perfectly clear view of the hallway door without being exposed to the large windows of the dormitory. The indoor air seemed to have become much colder, as if the temperature had plummeted absurdly and suddenly. The tension was becoming physically unbearable, a burden that left all my muscles aching and my breath short. It was then that true and complete darkness descended upon us all abruptly. The lights in the house and all the small power indicators on the electronic devices went out at once, plunging the entire property into a dense and impenetrable darkness. The refrigerator stopped working in the kitchen, and the heavy silence that followed was deafening and brutal. The creature had destroyed the power supply. That definitively proved that it was not a wild animal acting on feeding instinct. He was an intellectually superior hunter, isolating his prey before the kill. The main power panel was on the outer side, and he must have ripped the metal parts off with those terrifying claws. Without electricity, I had no outdoor lighting for the yard, no way to operate the gate motors at the property entrance, and the central heating system would stop working in a few hours, letting the lethal 30-degree Fahrenheit cold invade the rooms. The only weak source of light now was the pale, silvery glow of the full moon that filtered sparsely through the half-open curtains, casting severely distorted and grotesque shadows on the furniture. I groped in the dark on the floor until I found the tactical flashlight in my drawer, but I was too terrified to use it at that moment. Using a bright light would reveal exactly where I was hiding and draw the creature's attention directly to the bedroom windows. I remained in complete darkness, relying entirely on the adapted night vision and extraordinarily sharp hearing of my 3 dogs. Their senses were pushed to the extreme. The absence of electrical noises revealed macabre sounds that had previously been hidden throughout the house. I could clearly hear an incredibly deep, hoarse and moist breath coming directly from one of the front windows. It was a drawn-out breath, drawing air in guttural breaths, indicating that the being was pressed against the glass, trying to map our movements through the thin wooden walls. My fragile hope that he would leave after violently messing with the power panel was shattered in the most horrifying and unthinkable way possible. We were holding our breath in total silence when I heard an absurdly heavy impact on the side of the house's structure, followed by the violent creaking of the exterior wood giving way. The colossal creature was no longer just walking around the property, it was climbing the vertical walls. In a matter of a few agonizing seconds, I heard the ceiling dangerously collapsing under a massive weight directly above the central living room. The dogman had leapt and climbed onto the roof of my residence. Each step he took up there sounded like powerful seismic shocks that made the beams of the interior porch vibrate intensely. The asphalt shingles scraped under the weight and force of those enormous claws, and I could follow his disturbing trajectory as he slowly walked from side to side. He was deliberately assessing the structural strength of the roof, looking for a blind spot or an opening through which he could force his way in from above. The overwhelming psychological terror of this tactical maneuver was devastating to my mind. Knowing that this unholy monster, over 8 feet tall, was literally walking overhead, made me shrink painfully against the bedroom wall, clutching the loaded shotgun to my chest with all the strength I had left. My cane corsos, who until then had maintained a formidable defensive ground stance, began to show signs of extreme stress and disorientation. They raced down the dark hallway, staring at the ceiling, their sharp fangs fully exposed, ready to fight to the bloody end against something that was outside their territorial range. I tried to keep the 3 enormous dogs close to me at the bedroom door so they wouldn't be vulnerable in the large room. Above us, the creature began to scratch at the central structure of the roof with calculated slowness, as if to ensure I heard with extreme clarity the brutal destruction it was capable of wreaking. The suffocating feeling of helplessness reached its peak in that dark moment. If he decided to break the old wooden beams and freely collapse into the hallway, my weapon would be useless in the confined space, and my protectors would be massacred. The icy air was mercilessly dominating the house, making my body tremble violently in the darkness. The auditory and psychological torture on the roof lasted what seemed like endless hours of pure panic, until the weight of footsteps and the scratching on the wood suddenly ceased. The absence of movement up there brought no relief. It brought only a lethal and painful anticipation of what was to come. Seconds later, I heard the incredibly dense and brutal impact of the creature landing on the wooden deck in front of the main door, a few feet away from where the doormat was. The solid, rooted structure of the deck swayed dangerously under the force of hundreds of pounds falling from a significant height. The sepulchral silence returned even more suffocatingly until I heard a sound that chilled the blood in my veins in a way that absolutely nothing before had managed to do that night. The distinct metallic clang of the rigid front door handle being forced from the outside in. That macabre, wolf-like abomination was deliberately testing the door lock with its grotesque hands. He slowly turned the metal, forcing the safety mechanism with an intelligence that defied human sanity. He understood the basic engineering of how residential doors operated. The brutal realization that this creature possessed advanced motor skills heightened my alertness to a point of no return. Brutus, Nero, and Titan surged forward down the corridor and stopped in the living room, positioned facing the blocked entrance, adopting a definitive and relentless attack stance. If that oak door were breached, the hand-to-hand combat there would be the end of the line. I struggled to my feet, my weapon perfectly aligned on my aching shoulder, tiptoeing to the beginning of the central corridor to cover the rear of my animals. My legs threatened to give way at the slightest movement. The main entrance was very robust and had a heavy lock, but I was absolutely certain that if he applied the full monstrous weight of his body in a frontal attack, the wood would not withstand the mechanical pressure. The doorknob continued to swing repeatedly until it stopped abruptly. I held my breath, pointing the steel barrel directly at the middle of the door, expecting the violent rupture. It was in that paralyzing moment that from the other side of the thick wood I heard the most bizarre and disturbing attempt at vocalization I had ever witnessed. It wasn't animalistic breathing. It was a grotesquely drawn-out sound, forced through unnatural vocal cords, mimicking a deformed human voice in a lamenting tone, designed solely to break down my last emotional defenses. The sound emanating from the other side of the heavy oak door was a profound abomination that defied all laws of nature and destroyed any hope of rationality. It was a distorted voice, attempting to force a human intonation through vocal cords built for snarling and tearing flesh. The creature was mimicking the exact tone of a person pleading for help, but it lacked genuine emotion, sounding like a broken, macabre record etched into the depths of hell. That perfect mimicry of pain paralyzed me so completely that the weapon in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The goal wasn't to enter through a friendly plea, but rather to execute methodical psychological torture to break me from the inside. The audacity of a top predator using human emotions as bait proved its vast and utterly perverse intelligence. My 3 Cane Corso dogs understood the ruse immediately. They bared their fangs in an expression of silent, deadly fury, their muscles tensed to the limit, focused on the base of the door through which the sound penetrated. I stood frozen in the hallway, feeling the cold sweat trickle down my back as that distorted wail continued to echo across the wooden deck. After a few agonizing minutes of a failed attempt to get me to open the security latch, the vocalization ceased abruptly. The silence that followed was filled only by the heavy sound of monstrous feet slowly moving away from the front porch, dragging their claws across the wooden planks before stepping back onto the gravel of the yard. With the monster's temporary retreat from the main entrance, the lack of heating began to become a secondary yet incredibly dangerous enemy inside the house. The internal temperature continued to plummet rapidly, and the dense air in the house already registered around 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold was so intense that each breath of mine and my animal's breath formed small, dense white clouds of vapor in the darkness of the hallway. Absolute fear compelled me to act before my limbs became numb from the low temperature. I desperately needed to create a sturdy physical barrier, a tactical choke point, in case the creature decided to shatter the living room windows and breach the perimeter. I momentarily sheathed my weapon and leaned against an immense solid oak chest of drawers in the corner of the hallway, which must have easily weighed over 200 pounds. Using all the adrenaline and desperate force flooding my system, I slowly pushed the old piece of furniture across the wooden floor, taking extreme care not to create any noisy friction, positioning it precisely across the path, connecting the living room to my bedroom. If it entered the house, it would have to jump over this narrow obstacle, giving me a vital fraction of a second to aim a shot with my shotgun. This small mental fortification didn't lessen the horror of the situation, but it gave me a small sense of control over a scenario that was rapidly heading towards total annihilation. The pause in the direct attacks lasted only long enough for me to begin doubting my own mental stability until the lethal threat shifted direction in a way I hadn't anticipated in my worst nightmares. I felt a deep, rhythmic and constant structural vibration rising through the solid wood floor beneath my bare feet. My house, like many old buildings in rural Washington, had an unpaved crawl space about 3 feet high between the damp earthen floor and the thick supporting beams of the main floor. The creature had found the flimsy side door and entered the house's foundation. The terror of knowing that a monster of that size was literally crawling in the darkness beneath where I stood caused a wave of violent nausea. The vibration of its movements was overwhelming, proving that it was crawling belly first on the floor, squeezing its colossal mass between the old wood. The dogs went into a state of frantic alert, pointing their snouts directly at the hardwood floor, meticulously tracking the predator's path throughout the house with their keen hearing and sense of smell. The stench of rot, graveyard dirt, and old blood began to emerge from the small, square ventilation grates in the floor, filling the house's trapped air with an odor so caustic it burned their nostrils. I positioned myself behind the heavy, makeshift oak barricade, the butt of my rifle resting firmly on my aching shoulder, my eyes fixed on the metal ventilation grates embedded in the main hallway floor. Following the monster's submerged movements was immeasurable psychological torture. Suddenly, a violent and extremely heavy impact struck the wooden floor precisely where Titan was patrolling, causing the thick planks to arch dangerously upward. The force of the blow from below was so immense it nearly unbalanced my enormous dog. The creature was testing the floor's resistance, striking the wood with its back or massive shoulders in a grotesque attempt to break through the barrier and emerge directly into the middle of the house. I pointed the steel barrel of my weapon towards the point of impact, my trembling finger resting precariously on the trigger guard. But firing through the floor without visual confirmation would be a waste of ammunition I couldn't afford to commit. The predator delivered 3 more consecutive and severe blows against the floor, each sounding like a car crash into the house's structure, but the reinforced hardwood floor withstood the brutal force. Realizing it couldn't break the foundation so easily in that confined space of only 3 feet, the movement below us began to shift back toward the side exit, dragging the stale air currents through the earthen floor. The dogman's exit from its crawling space brought a brief moment of silence, but the tactical truce ended when my 3 dogs simultaneously advanced toward the vast living room, indicating that the creature had returned to the outer surface of the yard. I cautiously crawled to the edge of the wall, maintaining visual cover, and directed my gaze to the point where their attentions were fully fixed. The sharp, silvery moonlight, which had previously illuminated the center of the living room through the immense panoramic window, was abruptly eclipsed by a colossal dark mass. The dogman stood there in its fully erect bipedal posture, in all its macabre and devastating glory, just inches from the thin pane of double glass. The creature's height was so absurdly immense that its head blocked the entire upper expanse of the window, covering an area of more than 8 vertical feet. The little light that remained perfectly outlined the contours of his broad shoulders, like those of a formidable bear, and his elongated snout exhaling steam against the cold glass. He tilted his sinister head slowly, his amber eyes gleaming with incandescent, focused malice as he ran his giant claw along the outer surface of the window, leaving a deep, scratched mark that served as a warning that his patience with our defenses was definitely coming to an end. The line between safety and absolute abyss was brutally and mercilessly broken. The dogman, tired of the psychological game of lurking on the edges of my sanity, decided it was time to take physical control of the environment. Without any hesitation, he raised one of his monstrously long arms and delivered a devastating direct blow to the center of the double-paned glass in the living room. The impact was a deafening explosion of sharp shards flying in all directions, covering the wooden floor and carpets with thousands of cutting fragments. Immediately, the freezing night air, which was well below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, invaded the interior like a ghostly wave, bringing with it the metallic and repulsive smell of death emanating directly from the predator's thick fur. He passed through the shattered window frame with terrifying ease, forcing himself to hunch his gigantic shoulders and lower his massive wolf head to avoid hitting the ceiling of my living room. His presence within my sanctuary sucked all the oxygen from the place. Seeing him standing amidst my furniture exposed the true, colossal scale of his size. He easily stood over 8 feet tall and possessed a muscular build that must have weighed well over 400 pounds of pure brute force and hostility. The amber reflections of his eyes swept across the destroyed room and fixed on the hallway where I was crouching, marking the beginning of the bloodiest and most terrifying confrontation of my life. My 3 cane corsos didn't retreat an inch before the demonic invader. As soon as the beast's heel touched the living room floor, Titan, Brutus, and Nero charged forward like a coordinated military unit. We're talking about 3 trained animals, totaling almost 400 pounds of canine muscle in pure defensive fury, simultaneously clashing against the monster. The physical clash was indescribably violent and shocking. The dogman used his long arms and claws that seemed like steel scythes to keep the dogs away from his neck. I watched everything from the barricade in the hallway, my shotgun trembling violently against my shoulder, completely unable to fire. The chaos of the fight was too fast, a tangled mass of dark fur, teeth and blood, and pulling the trigger meant the extreme risk of hitting one of my protectors. The predator delivered an absurdly strong side blow that struck Nero's flank, sending the heavy dog flying through the air with repulsive ease. Nero slammed against the heavy dining table, shattering the oak furniture in half under the impact of his weight, sliding across the floor amidst the wreckage. Despite being considerably smaller in stature, Brutus seized the opening and sank his formidable jaws directly into the invader's right calf, tearing through the dark muscle tissue and forcing the monster to take a half-step back toward the shattered window. The pain from Brutus's attack provoked a furious reaction from Dogman. He grabbed my dog by the thick neck and lifted him off the ground as if he weighed no more than a few pounds, preparing to deliver a lethal blow with his other curved hand. It was in that exact second that my survival instinct overcame my paralyzing panic. I stood up from behind the oak dresser blocking the hallway, took 2 steps forward for a clear line of sight, and aligned the steel sight of the shotgun directly on the invader's broad, muscular chest. My finger tightened on the trigger with cold determination. The gunshot within the enclosed space was a physical force in itself, reverberating off the walls and temporarily muffling my hearing. The sharp recoil bruised my right shoulder, but I kept my eyes open to see the outcome. The chunky lead shot struck the predator in the left shoulder, very close to the junction with the neck. The kinetic force of the 12-gauge shot tore through the flesh and violently pushed him back, forcing him to drop Brutus to the ground. Thick, frighteningly dark blood splattered against the light-colored wall of the room, staining the wallpaper and floor with undeniable proof that the creature, however monstrous and supernatural it seemed, was made of flesh and could be wounded. The moment that followed the ballistic impact will be etched in my memory until my last breath. The dogman didn't fall. Any conventional animal would have been brought down and neutralized by the massive force of a direct shot from that proximity, but he merely staggered backward, bracing one of his immense claws against the window frame to maintain his balance. He brought his right hand to the open wound on his shoulder, examining the dark blood that flowed profusely down his arm, and then raised his head to look directly into my eyes. The look he gave me contained no pain or confusion. It contained a pure, profound, and utterly perverse intellectual rage. It was the look of a thinking being assessing the cost-benefit of the hunt. The atmosphere became deathly still. I pumped the shotgun, ejecting the empty cartridge and feeding a new lethal projectile into the chamber, keeping the weapon locked against his face. He understood the mechanical mechanism perfectly. Knowing that the next shot would inevitably be to his head, the predator exhaled a thick puff of vapor through its wide nostrils, took a cautious step back through the broken glass, and descended onto the wooden deck. It didn't flee in panic. It retreated with the posture of an imminent threat, slowly disappearing into the icy shadows of the yard, taking with it an aura of relentless hatred. Darkness swallowed the colossal figure of the monster in a matter of seconds, but its absence brought no peace. The temperature inside the house quickly matched the relentless 30 degrees Fahrenheit outside, causing my muscles to tremble uncontrollably. I stood in the hallway, shotgun in hand, waiting for a surprise attack from another direction for long, agonizing minutes. When the funereal silence of the forest finally settled, I lowered my weapon and ran to check on my defenders. Nero was rising from the wreckage of the dining table, limping heavily on one of his hind legs and displaying a deep cut on his side, but alive and alert. Brutus had severe abrasions on his neck from the monster's brutal grip, while Titan kept a high guard near the shattered window, patrolling the broken glass. The floor of my living room looked like a war zone, covered in glass, splintered wood, and pools of the predator's thick, putrid blood. I knew that being exposed to the open air was tactical suicide, so I dragged the heaviest piece of furniture I could find, the thick leather sofa, and positioned it against the wide-open window to create a rudimentary barricade against the biting wind. I sat on the icy floor, surrounded by my 3 dogs, while the adrenaline rush began to leave my system, replaced by the overwhelming certainty that that cold night in Washington had forever transformed me into a prisoner of fear. The rest of the early morning turned into an ordeal of physical endurance and a brutal test of my mental stability. The total absence of electricity meant that the ambient temperature ruled the interior of the house with an implacable iron fist, remaining stagnant at the cruel mark of 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Without the heating system, the air became a cutting blade. I hugged my dogs tightly, sitting in the darkest corner of the hallway, using the massive heat generated by the nearly 400 pounds of combined muscle of the 3 animals to avoid the onset of hypothermia. Each elongated shadow cast by the cold moonlight seemed to gain a life of its own, and each strong gust of wind that hit the exterior boards of the house sounded like the terrible promise that the monster was returning to finish the hunt. Nero emitted low, continuous groans of pain from the deep gash in his side, forcing me to use one of my heavy flannel shirts as an improvised tourniquet, tying the fabric as tightly as I could around his torso to try and stop the constant bleeding. The silence that engulfed the forest outside was artificial, dense, and devoid of any natural sound. That immense predator, with its colossal strength and wicked gaze, hadn't perished from the gunshot. It had strategically retreated to the safety of the trees. The nauseating smell of decay it exuded continued to permeate the curtains, the wooden walls, and even my clothes. The weapon remained firmly in my numb hands. The night dragged on in an agony that seemed endless, testing my psychological limits far beyond what I thought I could endure. As the first faint light of dawn began to break on the horizon, painting the perpetually overcast Washington state sky a pale, funereal gray, the brightness revealed the true physical extent of the nightmare we had faced. My living room resembled the epicenter of a devastating, destructive event. The heavy leather sofa, a piece of furniture easily exceeding 200 pounds, had been violently dragged away from its original position. The panoramic window, once the house's great architectural attraction, was nothing more than a jagged frame of shattered glass. But the detail that definitively cemented the horror was inspecting the outside through the shattered opening. In the damp dirt of the yard, the abomination's footprints were etched and perfectly delineated in the ground. They were marks measuring about 16 inches long, equipped with deep claws that tore through the compacted earth, indicating that the creature must have weighed a terrifying amount, well over 500 pounds. The long, widely spaced strides covered almost 5 feet between each impact, demonstrating a frighteningly efficient and swift bipedal locomotion. Beyond the footprints, there was the thick, dark trail of its blood severely staining the gravel and dry leaves, forming a macabre path that disappeared into the unforgiving depths of the forest. Confronting that physical evidence in broad daylight shattered any attempt my mind made to create a protective illusion. An undeniable predatory anomaly had invaded my home. The immediate decision to abandon the property forever was not made with hesitation. It was a rudimentary imposition of my will to remain alive. I understood that I would not be able to endure the approaching night in that cursed place. Without collecting any superfluous belongings, I took only my car keys, my wallet, and kept my shotgun cocked at my side. I drove Titan, Brutus, and Nero with extreme tactical caution to the pickup truck parked a few feet from the main entrance. The morning air continued to punish the atmosphere, and the sky threatened an imminent blizzard. The journey along the nearly 3 miles of potholed dirt road to reach the main highway was the most paralyzing and agonizing drive of my entire existence. My eyes darted frantically from the rearview mirrors to the dense barriers of trees along the way, in the terrifying expectation of seeing the monstrous silhouette emerge abruptly from the forest shadows to obstruct my escape. The mere swaying of the branches sent painful throbs through my chest. The suffocating sensation of being intensely watched from behind only began to dissipate when the heavy tires of my car finally touched the smooth asphalt of the highway, establishing a direct route to the urban core of Seattle. Leaving my isolation behind represented a painful loss, but the forest no longer belonged to me. A corrupted sentinel had claimed that territory with blood. As soon as I crossed the borders of the civilized city, I immediately sought out a veterinary clinic with emergency services to help the true heroes of that early morning. The professional in charge, a doctor with vast experience, showed utter perplexity at the traumatic severity of Nero's cut and the massive hematomas on Brutus's thick neck. He questioned me incisively about what kind of gigantic brown bear or alpha feline could have inflicted such brutal punishment on formidable hunting dogs. To avoid scrutiny and protect my own reputation, I fabricated a superficial story about the sudden attack of a hungry puma of abnormal dimensions. Trying to describe the truth, narrating the existence of a colossal predator with wolf-like features, walking on 2 legs, and demonstrating reasoning abilities, would result in my direct referral to a psychiatric board. The bureaucratic system and human understanding lack the tools to deal with abominations that inhabit the darkest corners of the continent. The Washington authorities would file a police report for common animal aggression and close my tragedy. A few months after the incident, I sold the 10 acres of land to a logging corporation for a pittance, driven by the desperation to eradicate any legal ties to that fateful location. Currently, my life is confined to a fortified apartment in the vibrant heart of Seattle, completely surrounded by thick concrete walls, uninterrupted artificial lighting, and the constant flow of thousands of people. Despite the geographical distance, absolute peace has become an unattainable illusion. The terror that consumes my soul is not just the memory of aggression. It's the undeniable realization that our species does not dominate the top of the food chain when we cross the boundaries of urbanization. Traditional biology fails miserably to catalog beasts that see humanity only as a fragile target. Every time the temperature drops sharply and winter sets in, dragging the frigid climate down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, I lock myself in my refuge, and the panic resurfaces in a devastating way. The dogman is an undeniable fact. He remains out there, wandering in the shadows with his colossal stature and cruel intellect, patiently watching for the next individual who makes the lethal mistake of underestimating the dangers of the night and the vastness of the American forests. The darkness harbors secrets that destroy the human mind. If you've made it this far and felt your heart race with tension, know that the world is full of mysteries that science still can't explain. Encounters with dogmen aren't mere folklore. They are terrifying legends that take shape when civilization sleeps. To not miss the next genuine accounts of pure terror and continue exploring these frightening stories with us, subscribe to website channel name Mr. Nightmare Scares. You leave a like, comment if you would have the courage to live in isolation after this, and share this video to spread fear. Remember, true terror always awaits outside your window.